Hello, this is Maria Williams. In today's video, I am making two cards with Concord and Ninth's Osnap stamps and dies. The first card is an interactive card for a belated birthday, and the second one is a Slimline card that I ink blended with 3 different colors of Distress Oxide inks. The little critters are from Pretty Pink Posh's Cupcake Critters stamp set. Here's a quick look at the products from Concord and Ninth that I'm going to be using. This is the Osnap Stamp Set, and as you can see, it has the camera, the little Polaroid picture stamp, as well as a couple of different hearts, some sentiments, and some little tiny images that you can use to fill in. And here is the die set. You get a smile die cut, as well as some little hearts that you can use for a shaker card, for example. And this is a foil paper pack. It's called the Formals Foil Paper Pack that includes 3 different colors, black, white, and graphite. And I think this is a great pack for masculine cards as well as glossy accents. The first thing I'm going to do is work on the camera. So I've put a piece of the black foil cardstock into my MISTI, and I already have the stamp set up in the door. So I'm just taking some Versamark ink, inking up my stamp really well after I have prepped the cardstock with my embossing powder tool. And as you can see, this stamped really well, and so I'm just going to go ahead and cover it with white embossing powder. I'm using Stambendis Stambendis white embossing powder, and I'm just going to coat the cardstock and then use my heat tool to melt it. My original plan was to cut out the photo images from the white foil cardstock, but I changed my mind because you can't stamp with regular inks onto that cardstock, and I didn't really want to heat emboss everything, so please ignore the little photo die cut that is sitting on the desk. So the next thing I did was to take the dies and separate them. They do come all together. And then I'm just using a couple of pieces of purple tape to tape down the camera die to the cardstock, and I'm going to run it through my Big Shot. I had my silver embossing powder standing by just in case I decided to emboss with silver instead of the white, but I really like the way the white turned out. Since I'm making an interactive card, I want the little photograph, the Polaroid, to come out from behind the camera, and I need to cut a slit in the camera. The die set comes with a die to do this, so the next thing I did was to line up the die with that lower area of the opening, and I ran it through my Big Shot. To my disappointment, when I pulled off the purple tape from the die cut, some of the embossing came off, and when I looked at it closely, it looked like the ink was still there, so I decided to try to just pour some more of the powder over it and see if it would stick and see if I could heat emboss it, and that seemed to work okay. Later on in the video, I had a little bit that was still missing, so what I did instead was to take my white gel pen and draw it in, and that worked perfectly. I did have a little bit of stray embossing powder, so all I did was take a very small paintbrush and brush that all off, and then, like I said, I got a pretty crisp image. I really don't understand why this happened, because the rest of the embossing, I rubbed it and rubbed it, as you can see in the video, and it wasn't coming off. So I guess that tape was just a little too tacky, or maybe I didn't heat it enough. I'm not really sure. To make sure that the slider mechanism worked properly, I needed to add a little bit of dimension behind the camera. So I started cutting out thin pieces of double-sided adhesive foam and placing them around where the Polaroid would slide. And then I realized that there was a much easier way to do this, and that is to use fun foam. I have some fun foam in my stash that I got locally at a hobby store, and it happens to have adhesive on one side, which is great. So I die cut it in such a way that the adhesive is facing the camera that I heat embossed, and then I just marked first of all where the opening was for the Polaroid, and then I figured out where the rest of the Polaroid would sit when it was all the way in, and I just marked it. Then I took some scissors and cut that excess out. And I didn't really need to cut this into two separate pieces. I could have left it all connected. But what happens with fun foam when you put it through your die cutting machine is that it does get smushed and it stretches just a little bit. And I probably could have left it so that it would return to its normal original thickness, but I really didn't want to wait. So what I did is I just cut it into two pieces. So I cut the bottom and then I cut out the rest of it where the Polaroid would sit. Then all I had to do is remove any excess that I might have had and remove the adhesive backing and glue the two pieces down to the back of the die cut. I made sure that none of the fun foam was overlapping so that the camera would sit nice and flat on the front of my card. Next, I went to work on the Polaroid. I'm making this card with my nephew in mind. His birthday was in June, and yes, I realize it's the middle of July. So I am going to be using the sentiment that refers to forgetting the birthday. So I set up the Polaroid stamp in my MISTI and stamp that with Memento Tuxedo black ink. And then I wanted to overlap the heart with the sentiment, so I set up the heart in my MISTI as well, stamped it with blush ink from the stamp market, and then when that was done I cleaned off the stamp and removed it, and then set up the stamp that says I can't believe I forgot your birthday, and stamped that with Memento Tuxedo black ink. And then I also decided I wanted the Osnap. I think it's cute, and of course it goes with the camera. So I set that up as well and stamped it with the same Memento Tuxedo black ink. All that's left is to die cut it out with a coordinating die, and it's ready to go on the card. I'm placing the smile die cut at the top of the card, and I wanted it to have a little tiny bit of dimension, so I went ahead and stacked 2 layers of leafy cardstock from the stamp market and put the die on top and ran it through my die cutting machine. I just used my Nuvo Deluxe adhesive to glue the 2 die cuts together. I had sprayed the cardstock with some Lawn Fawn shimmer, but it ended up not showing up very much, probably because I didn't put enough and also because the die cut is so thin, so I skipped that part of the video. I will be using it for the next card. The paper I'm using for the front of the card is from the Stamp Market. It's from the Color Crush Basics paper pack, and I've already trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches so that I get 1/8 of an inch all the way around it. And I'm going to go ahead and attach that first, and then I'm going to attach the camera. I need to pull here at the bottom of the Polaroid so that the recipient knows that there's a little message in there. So I took out the stamp that says that from the Osnap Stamp Set and attached it onto an acrylic block, and I'm going to stamp it in blush ink. And unfortunately it really didn't show up well at all, so I decided to stamp over it with black ink. And this is one of those instances where I wish I had used my MISTI because I would have gotten the second stamping right over the first one, but it is what it is. So I went ahead and stamped it over, and you can see a little bit of the shadow of the pink, but I think it's okay. You could use any kind of adhesive you like to attach the camera onto the card, but I didn't want to risk liquid glue, but I needed a strong adhesive, so I'm using this 1/8 of an inch double-sided adhesive from scrapbook.com, and of course I could have used a thicker one for the larger area there, but it was just easier to put a couple layers of this thinner one. So I'm just making sure I've got plenty of adhesive. Then I'm just going to thread the Polaroid through and attach this to the front of the card. I made sure that the Polaroid was moving freely in and out of the camera, and then I attached the smile die cut with my liquid adhesive, and the dot was still stuck in the negative space in the cardstock that I cut it out from. So in order to place it exactly where I needed it, I just left it in there and put dot of liquid adhesive on it, then place that negative space around the die cut that was already on the card and press the dot out onto the card. I could have left the card like this, but I wanted to add a couple of embellishments. So I took some black stars from my stash and randomly adhered them to the card front. And then I wanted to add a little bit more detail to the camera itself. So I decided to take this piece of paper also from the stamp market and cut out that little strip of colors. And I wanted to do 3 colors right in the middle of the camera, kind of to imitate the logo of Polaroid, which obviously it's not those colors, but they do have a strip with 3 colors. So I went ahead and inked up the camera and stamped it onto my paper that's in my MISTI so that I could tell exactly where I needed to put my little strip of paper. And then I put the strip of paper down, inked up the camera again, and stamped it onto the strip. Then I just trimmed it out with my scissors, and with a little dot of glue, I attached it to the camera. And that completed the card. I think it turned out really cute, and it's a card that you can use for men or for women, and you can probably use it for multiple occasions as well. So on to card number 2. Since I don't make a lot of slimline cards, I did have a little cheat sheet. So I got some envelopes just from the post office a little while ago because I just thought that I might want to make some of these cards. And the envelopes are 4 1/8 by 9 1/2. And so I decided to cut my card base so that the finished size would be 3 3/4 by 9 1/4, which makes the front panel for my card 3 1/2 by 9. So the piece of cardstock that I'm going to be inking is 3 1/2 by 9. And I'll have those dimensions on my blog post, or you can pause where I have the little cheat sheet up and you can see all the dimensions. So the 3 colors that I have chosen to use are mustard seed, cracked pistachio, and peacock feathers. Since I want really good coverage, I'm just using an ink blending tool, and what I'm blending on top of is a Ken Oliver Best Matte Ever. These were really popular years ago, and I had put mine away because it was really sticky, and lint and everything would stick to the top of it, and I had a really hard time getting it off, so I had put it away. And then I came across it and decided that it would be great for ink blending because it pretty much holds the paper and the mat itself doesn't move. So if you have one of these old ones stashed away, you might want to bring it out. Otherwise, I know Waffle Flower has some white mats. I think it's called a media mat. And I know Alton U has a mat as well. But anyway, so you can also just hold this down onto your work surface and ink it up. So the color on the top is mustard seed, and then the color on the bottom is the peacock feathers. I like to either do the color in the middle first, or do the ones on the 2 ends and then the color in the middle. So now I'm starting with cracked pistachio. I've shifted my piece of cardstock up and down a little bit as I was blending the first 2 colors. So I decided to take my piece of cardstock off and really wipe my surface down well so that the colors wouldn't mix onto my card panel. I could have also gotten a scrap of paper to protect my fingers from the ink and make sure I didn't transfer it, but since I already had the coverage I wanted on the 2 ends, I figured I would just be careful and I wouldn't have any problems, which I didn't. I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer to the panel, so before moving on to that, I pulled out my heat gun and made sure to dry the ink really well. And then I got my Lawn Fawn liquid Stardust. I got this a little while ago, and it's pretty versatile. So I could have mixed it with water to thin it down a little bit. I could also have put it in a spray bottle with some water, but I decided to just put a little puddle of it on my pad, and then just take a small paintbrush and splatter it onto the panel. Some of my droplets were kind of big, so I took a paper towel and just placed it onto the panel to absorb some of the liquid Stardust. And look at how shiny this looks. This is really pretty in person. I hope that you can see it on the video. All the elements on the front of my card are going to be colored with Copic markers. So I'm using, again, Memento Tuxedo black ink to stamp everything onto some 80-pound Nina Solar white cardstock. I'm starting with the camera, and I did stamp that twice to make sure that I had a really good impression. And then I stamped some Polaroids. I ended up doing 4 of them. I was going to do some masking, and so I just wanted to have an extra one just in case I messed one up. The reason I picked these two particular critters out of the stamp set is because they fit the best into my Polaroid frames. So the first image is the smallest, so I only have to mask the bottom of my Polaroid in order to make sure that it fits, and I can put my piece of cardstock all the way in the bottom of my MISTI. I'm using Post-it tape, which is my favorite for simple masking because when you stamp on it, the ink dries pretty quickly, so you don't have to worry about it smearing. I'm placing my critter at a little bit of an angle. I think it gives it a little bit more character than just having everything perfectly straight and lined up within the frame. I stamped the image twice to make sure that I got a really good impression and that the thickness matched the thickness of the frame. I did pretty much the same thing for the second critter, except that because this stamp was larger, I wasn't able to put my piece of cardstock all the way at the bottom of the MISTI. I just put it a little bit away from the edge, and since I had the Post-it tape for masking, that also held the cardstock in place. I die cut the camera with the coordinating die, and I trimmed around the Polaroids with my scissors, and then I brought out a whole bunch of Copic markers that coordinated really well, but really that matched as closely as possible the three colors of Distress Oxide inks that I had used on the card. And I also brought out the C1, C3, C5, and C7. I'm not sure that I use C7, but to color the camera. So for mustard seed, the yellows that I thought were the closest out of my stash were Y04 and Y08. For cracked pistachio, YG41, and then for peacock feathers, I mainly use BG13. And I tried to put the caps on my work surface as I was coloring, but I will have a picture of all the Copics in a jar on my blog, so if you want to know exactly what colors I used, I will have them all on my blog post. I forgot to mention before that the cardstock I'm using for the camera is not white cardstock. It is actually fog cardstock, which is a light gray, and it's from Fawn. I really like this shade of cardstock, and I like this cardstock because it's nice and thick. Since it does have a little bit of color to it, I did test out my Copic markers on a scrap of the cardstock before I used them directly on my die cut piece, just because the colors will look a little bit different on the gray cardstock than they would on white. I've sped up my coloring to about 350%. There's nothing fancy about it. I wasn't trying to do a lot of shading. In a couple of places I did use a couple different shades of the same color, but for the most part it's just really, really simple coloring. You could use any kind of coloring medium that you choose. You could use watercolors, you could use watercolor markers, you could use pencils with Gamsol, anything you want at all. And one thing to remember, particularly about Copics, is that if you don't have a whole lot of colors and you want to do a little bit of shading, you can always use a light gray to create a slightly darker shadow. So for example, on the cherry, I used RV29. I actually thought I had grabbed R29, but it is RV29, which looks great too. And I didn't really have another color that was a little bit darker, so I just took my it was either C1 or C3, and just added a little bit at the bottom to create a little bit of a darker shade. If you've been considering buying Copics but you think that they're pretty expensive, I think they're definitely worth it. You can get these refilled. You don't even have to buy the whole refill yourself. If you have a local store, well, I guess it depends on where you live, but where I live, about 25 minutes away, there's a scrapbooking and card making store, and they will refill the markers for you for just a few dollars. And the other thing is that you can also replace the nibs on the markers. So once the marker runs out of ink, you don't have to throw it away and buy a whole new one. So I finished coloring the two Polaroids, the one at the top and the one at the bottom. And for the one in the middle, I wanted to do something a little bit differently. So I ended up taking a small Celebrate die that is part of the round Never Ending card die set. And I used it to create some little letters. So the first thing I did was to take a scrap of cardstock and die cut the celebrate with the little letters, and I started to pull the letters out, and then I realized it would be so much easier to color them while they were still in the cardstock. So I put the one letter back and then took the three main markers and colored the letters in, making sure that I didn't have two of the same color next to each other. Once all the letters were colored in, I trimmed the cardstock so that I could use it as a guide on my little Polaroid. I popped all the letters out, attached the negative space to the Polaroid with a couple pieces of tape, and then instead of trying to put glue on the back of these tiny letters, I just very carefully put little dots of glue into the spaces where each letter would go, and I did a couple of them at a time so that my glue wouldn't dry and I would have enough time to pop the letter in. And yeah, just made sure I picked up the cardstock after I put a few letters in. I think I did, yeah, one row at a time, picked it up, made sure that the guide wasn't sticking to the Polaroid, but that the letters were, and then continued on to the next row. And this was a little bit fussy, I'm not gonna lie. It did take a little bit of time, but I think in the end it was worth it. The only thing I wish is that I had made the letters maybe a little bit darker, but I think they look cute. What you could do to make this process a little bit easier is before you die cut the celebrate is to put adhesive sheet on the back of the cardstock, and that way your little letters will already have adhesive on the back. Once I had all the letters glued down, I just removed my guide, and then I took one of the little candle stamps from the Cupcake Critters stamp set and stamped it in Memento Tuxedo Black ink, which is the same ink I've used for everything else, and then just colored it in with my Copics. I used the yellow for the flame and then the blue and green to color the candle itself. I now had all my elements ready to go, so I arranged them on the card panel and decided that I wanted that click sentiment next to each one of the Polaroids. I arranged all the elements on my card panel and decided that I wanted to add the click sentiment next to each one of the Polaroids. So I made sure that everything was nicely tacked down onto the panel and also onto my MISTI pad, and then I placed the stamp where I wanted it next to each one of the Polaroids, picked it up with the door, and then inked it up and stamped it. I was super careful that I didn't get any ink onto the door that might get onto any of my card elements. It was fine to have the panel hanging off beyond the pad of the MISTI, but when I was getting ready to stamp on the lower section of the panel, I did move it so that that section of the panel was on top of the pad. Otherwise, it would be kind of floating a little bit, and when I pressed down, I probably would not have gotten a good impression. I took my panel out of the MISTI and attached all the elements with some foam tape. The foam tape that I'm using is the 1-inch double-sided foam tape, double-sided adhesive foam tape from scrapbook.com. And the only thing to watch out for here is that you don't put double-sided adhesive on a section of a Polaroid that is going to sit on top of another Polaroid, because then you'd have two layers of foam tape on that one. I could have mounted some of them directly onto the card and then some of them with foam tape, but I really wanted foam tape behind all of them. Before I attached this panel to the front of the card, I decided to work on the inside of the card. So I chose one more critter from the Cupcake Critters stamp set and stamped it on the lower right hand corner of the inside of the card. I took it out of the MISTI and colored it in, and then attached the front panel, and then I realized there was no sentiment other than celebrate, so I took the happy birthday sentiment from the same stamp set and stamped it at the top of the inside of the card. So that finished card number 2. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to give you one last look at both cards, but I do think this Osnap Stamp Set from Concord and Ninth is really versatile. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. Links to the products is in the description. And here is a look at the first card with the interactive feature. Who wouldn't love that? And all the little details. And here's card number 2 with all the shine, the fun critters, and of course the unusual size. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.